Many years ago, I worked on an ambulance. One day we were dispatched to a person not acting right type of call. When my partner and I arrived at the apartment complex, the first thing we noted was that all the people, except for the patient that were living in the same unit, were standing outside with terrified looks on their faces, shaking violently. It was raining and nighttime. I quickly approached them and asked what was going on. The 25-year-old male looked at me and said, "We were playing a game when suddenly my girlfriend started shrieking and screaming. All the lights went out, including the candles. Then we saw her lay on her stomach on top of the board game. My girlfriend's head, hands, and legs all went into the air. Suddenly she fell to the floor, stood up, and ran into the back of the apartment. My partner and I then cautiously walked up the steps to the apartment door with mag lights. The door was already cracked open. I politely knocked and introduced myself as a 911 ambulance paramedic before walking inside the apartment unit. The light switch did not work. I could hear a creaking wooden noise in the background, squeaking back and forth. All the walls were painted dark colors like black and maroon. It was obvious that these people liked heavy metal, skulls, and dark paintings because they were represented all over the walls. I started walking through the apartment, calling out for the patient, looking for any sign of her. As I walked deeper and deeper into the unit, it started getting colder and colder. Finally, I saw her in a rocking chair. She was slowly rocking back and forth, looking straight forward. I introduced myself to her and asked her what is going on. There was no answer. She kept rocking back and forth. I got up close to her looking for any medical abnormalities. Her eyes were so black. Either her pupils were that big or her eye color was just that dark. All of her vital signs were normal. Her blood sugar was normal. She did not appear to be having any seizure activity. I tried to get painful stimulus out of her by squeezing the shoulder or a sternal rub, but she would not even flinch. I couldn't find any track marks on her for drug use. Throughout all of this, she just kept rocking, looking straight forward. The rule of thumb for paramedics now for this situation, not being alert to person, place, time, or event, is that she needs to go to the hospital. I tell her that since she is not talking with me, I'll be moving her to a stretcher. Suddenly, the rocking stops. All sound everywhere stops. I can only hear breathing. I lift under her armpits and my partner lifts under her legs. As we lift, we notice something very strange. The patient stays in a seated form, rigid. We lay her on the stretcher and wheel her to the inside of the ambulance. As we load her into the back, cracking noises like breaking tree branches filled the air. I look at her and notice now that she is looking right at me with a huge, scary, crazed smile on her face. No matter where I moved, her head and eyes traced me with that same unwavering smile. My partner looks over at me with sympathy, knowing I'll have to stay in the back with her. I playfully say, "Good, now maybe you'll talk to me." We begin riding to the hospital. The heat was on full blast in the back of the ambulance. However, it would not heat up. She was still smiling that big, toothy smile and staring at me, not answering any of my questions. I looked down to grab my pen that fell on the floor, and then looked back up. Out of nowhere, the highest pitched screams and shrieks filled the air as she started lunging and grabbing at me. She clashed her teeth and bit in my direction, trying all she could to break loose. Luckily, the stretcher seatbelts were secured to her, making me just out of reach. The huge crazy smile broke into a frightening look of terror and anger. I kept my back against the wall. Luckily, we were already at the hospital, unintentionally, a Catholic one. As the ambulance drove in, the patient stopped all she was doing. She calmly looked forward and went mute again. We brought her into the ER and talked with the doctor about what happened, who, needless to say, was astonished by the story. I'd like to preface this story by saying that this is not my encounter, but my great aunt's encounter. She told this story to me a few years back, after many years of me pestering her about it. I'd grown up knowing vague details of the story, but never the full thing. I did record the entire conversation that we had, and to this day I still have it on my phone. I will be transcribing the exact conversation, with slight changes to the names for privacy. So here we go. When David and I were younger, and before we got married and even afterwards, we had a Ouija board at our house, and we think that this might have been the cause of everything that came after. Anyways, we used to play with the Ouija board all the time, and one night when we got married, we moved into this mobile home down the road, further down from where we are now. Michael was born, but he was only about a year or so old, and Billy Joe was a baby. So Trisha, this aunt's sister, had a boyfriend named Brian. One day I came home from work, the very first day I had this brand new job at MSI, and the babysitter had told me that Brian had been there that day, and that he really wanted to see me, that it was important. I tried to call, but there was no answer. I tried and tried, but still no answer. So I thought, if it's really that important, he'll come back. Well, he shot himself. He went home that day and shot himself. So of course my question was, what did he want me for? Why did he want to see me? About a year later, we got the Ouija board out. We were having a party, young and stupid. We were only about 18 or 19 years old at the time, and so I asked the Ouija board with 2 other people doing it, what did Brian Langle want to see me about that day? He came back and said his name was Link, which was Brian's nickname, L-Y-N-K. And I said, what did he want to see me about? And he said he wanted to tell me that he caught David and Trisha kissing each other at the shack. David and I were already married, so there were denials and whatever. But it turns out it was true. That's exactly what had happened. He had caught them kissing each other, and that's why he broke up with Trisha. So that's all he wanted to see me about. So that's just a prelude to the story, because from that point on, our lives changed. Within a couple weeks, Michael started seeing an imaginary friend. When Michael got old enough to talk, he would say stuff like,
"Can I go out and play? Bardo is out there waiting for me."
He started throwing his toys out the front room window of the trailer, and we'd get up and they'd all be gone. Everything in the room would be gone out the window. We'd ask, why'd you do that? And he'd say, well, Bardo made him do it. So what do we do about it? We couldn't do anything because we thought Bardo was imaginary. So then Billy Joe gets old enough to talk, and he's really scared of everything. He's scared of his shadow. He clung to me, and for most of his life he slept on my chest until he was about 10. One night, he kept saying that he was seeing this person in his closet, and it was a mobile home, right? So the closet is tiny, and so was the bedroom. David and I were laying in bed. It was a summer night, and Billy Joe said,
"Mom, he's bothering me."
I said, just go to sleep, honey. It's okay, go to sleep. Then we heard talking through the walls, chattering with someone, but not loud enough to hear the words, like a child's voice heard softly through really thin walls. And then we heard a response, a deep voice, low and guttural, answering him back. Terrified and in disbelief, I said, "Billy Joe, run to mommy, baby." So he did. He came running. Then I had to go get Michael because he was in the next room down. I was terrified, and so was David. David was so terrified he wouldn't even get out of the bed to go get Michael. In fact, he kept Billy Joe with him, and I had to go get Michael. And it was the next day that we started saying, okay, what did you see? Who is it? And blah, blah, blah. And come to find out, both boys saw him, and they started explaining things. He was a little man. His name was Bardo. He wore a banner across his chest, and it said Bardo on it. Though at the time they didn't know it said anything, just that they described this ribbon going across his chest with letters on it. He was always in the backyard trying to get them both to come out. So then we moved, and about 3 years later, they started putting videos on TV. It was a Thursday night show. Michael Jackson was the first video that we ever saw, his 1983 Thriller. We were sitting there watching. He was trying to make fun of The Exorcist with this little man. He was about 3 feet tall, a little gremlin, and there was a banner across his chest that said Bardo on it. We thought, holy sweet Jesus, that's him. David came home and we just kept watching because we didn't have a VCR. The only way we could see it was to just keep waiting for them to put the video on again. David saw it, and we talked about and chalked it up to coincidence so as to not scare the boys. Now, when David was little, he used to see someone called the Spring Man. He was absolutely terrified of him and had had experiences with the Spring Man as a child that were similar to the experiences the boys did with Bardo. So we were watching a Stephen King movie one night, and it was about a man that was scared to death on a plane. Well, this plane started to have turbulence. It was storming out, and the guy looks out the window, and there was Bardo on the wing of the plane, only without the banner this time. At this point, my aunts get into discussion about this show, and they realize it was not a Stephen King movie, but in fact the Twilight Zone. It is the scene with the gremlin on the wing of the plane. It was at this point that David pipes up and says, "That's the Spring Man." So not only had David seen him as a child, but so had the boys, his kids. That was all I could get out of her on the subject, which was more than enough for me. I looked up the picture of the gremlin from the scene in the Twilight Zone, and it brought my aunt to tears. They are still very much afraid of these experiences, and there were many more, but were not mentioned by her in this story. Even Billy Joe, who's 40 years old today, refuses to acknowledge or talk about any of these experiences. I grew up in a large, dark and damp cliché of what everyone pictures a haunted house would look like. For more than 100 years, the house has loomed on top of a hill lined with foreboding oak trees where murders of crows would frequently stop. I have an older sister, 7 years older, who was a problem child and very into the occult, demons, and devil worshipping, and she would terrify my younger brother and I with stories, and just the general way she would look at us blankly. She wore black lipstick and dyed her hair black. When she turned about 13, she became even more rebellious, and she would run away and be missing for weeks and months. She was the one who originally introduced my brother and I to the Ouija board. My mother was an alcoholic, mentally ill woman. She is bipolar and was suicidal, and she was in charge of watching us kids while my dad worked the night shifts, and many times double shifts. To say our home had a bad energy would be an understatement. We would later learn the dark history of our home from the 90-year-old woman across the street. Mrs. Looker told us that our home was built as a home for unwed mothers, and so many births, deaths, and abortions, at the time this was very much frowned upon, happened there over the years. It served that purpose for about 20 years until it was forced to be shut down, and then was sold into a family who lived there until 1970, when my father bought it for an unbelievable price. He still lives there today. The first prefacing experience is one that I very vaguely remember, but my mom has told me in full detail many times, and my dad, who doesn't believe in ghosts, also corroborates. My mom was outside sunbathing and my sister was inside with a friend of hers. I went into the kitchen and grabbed a butter knife and was holding it in a fist with the tip pointed to the ground when I slowly walked into the living room where my sister was playing with her friend. I had a blank look on my face and was shaking and kept repeating that,
"Mommy needs help. She's fighting the devil across the street in a tunnel."
My sister yelled for my mom, and she came into the house and asked me what was wrong, and I just kept repeating,
"Mommy needs help. She's fighting the devil across the street in a tunnel."
My mom kept shaking me and telling me she was right here and to snap out of it. She said I was in that state for about an hour, where I was just staring off into nowhere. And finally, I snapped back into reality. I started acting normal, but didn't remember anything. My mom was convinced I was possessed. Later that night, when it was bath time, she noticed that I had 3 bad burn marks on my shoulder, that she says looked like they were from the claws of a demon. It's also important to note that my mother was abandoned as a child. She was adopted and has always been spiritual. She has experienced being saved by a guardian angel when she was young. She found herself too far away from her rural house at nightfall and felt impending danger closing in on her. She can't explain what it was, but she knew she was in danger and scared. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she was all of a sudden on her front porch, which was hundreds of yards away from where she was. So the next experience was from my younger brother's perspective. He is younger by a year and a half, and we shared a bedroom and bunk beds until I was 11. I slept on the top bunk and he was on the bottom. Our room was always extremely messy with toys scattered all over the place. One morning about 4 a.m., my brother woke up, and he said he saw my mom crouched down to clean up the toys. He only saw her back and her hair, which was a mix of gray and dyed blonde. My mother always wore a long, light blue, flowy nightgown to bed, which was easily recognizable. He didn't think anything of it and went right back to sleep. In the morning, when we both woke up, the room was spotless, and I asked him how that happened. He explained that he saw Mom in there cleaning in the middle of the night. At breakfast, we asked her why she cleaned our room, and needless to say, she told us she had never been in our room. She went in to look and was amazed at how clean it was, since it was never like that. Around this time, my brother started getting frequent night terrors that would scare the living shit out of me. I'd wake up to him screaming, standing in the corner of the room facing the wall, and banging his head into it. Sometimes he would be saying,
"I'm sorry, God,"
over and over. Sometimes he would be sitting in the middle of the room with his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth, saying things that didn't make sense while bawling his eyes out. My dad would come down the long, dark hallway to our room and try to snap him out of it. Sometimes he would slap him hard to see if he could get a reaction, but his demeanor would never change. Eventually, my dad said to just leave him be, because nothing seemed to snap him out of it. And if you can imagine, this was terribly scary as a kid. I'd wake up in a living nightmare, scared out of my mind, having to watch him do this for sometimes an hour straight, until he would climb back into bed and fall asleep. I remember one particularly scary episode. When I woke up, he was sitting on the dresser Indian style, with his back to the mirror, covering his eyes and crying, and he was saying,
"No, I won't. You can't make me look."
I would try talking to him, and sometimes he would respond, but with simple answers. I grabbed him by the hand and told him we should go get some water. He got off the dresser and followed me into the bathroom, but refused to go in. I went in and turned the faucet on so he could drink out of it, but he didn't want to go into the bathroom because of the mirror above the sink. I finally pushed him, and he looked at himself in the mirror and let out the loudest, blood-curdling scream, and was so frightened at his reflection that he passed out. This continued for years and would probably happen once every 2 or 3 months, and always in the wee hours of the morning. When I finally moved out of that room down the long hallway to the big bedroom around age 11, it was almost more scary waking up down there, alone, hearing my brother's fits down the hall. A few more important details about this house that you'll need to know is that the electrical and plumbing systems were very old and never updated. As a result, many lights would never work, including the most important one for me as a child, the light in the long dark hallway outside my room, which connected to my brother's room, sister's room, and the only bathroom, which was straight down the hallway. When my brother was having his fits, I'd open the door and reach my hand out to flick the light switch on, but it would rarely work. If I wanted to go check on him, I'd have to run down the hallway in the pitch dark, filling the walls to get to his room. This was the worst. So many times I'd just be too scared and would stay in my room with my light on. Now, the old plumbing and piping in the house meant that when you turned on a faucet, not only would it sometimes be a rusty red-colored water for a few seconds, which would then turn into clear, normal-looking water, but there was a distinct whistle sound when it came out. which intensified with how strong the stream was. Many times I'd wake up, and I'd hear the whistle and the water on full blast in the bathroom. I'd have to sprint down the pitch-dark hallway to flick on the bathroom light and shut off the faucet. Imagine that dread for a second. Not only do you have to sprint down the hallway towards the scary noise in the dark, but you think that anything could be in that bathroom when you flick the light on. Then I'd have to sprint down the hall again to my room. The worst part is after I would shut it off and get back to sleep, I'd wake up an hour later to the faucet on again. This happened intermittently for years. My dad always said it was just my brother doing it to scare me, but my brother denied it. This would be a pretty elaborate hoax to pull for so many years. The last thing I want to preface before getting into the terrifying Ouija night regards one of my girlfriends in my adult years. I was dating a beautiful Venezuelan woman with long black hair. We dated for about a year before I learned of her childhood in Venezuela, where she gained local notoriety as an incredibly powerful medium. Some days, she claimed as many as 30 ghosts would be trying to communicate through her. It got so bad that her mother had to take her to Zimbabwe to a witch doctor who was renowned for being able to reverse or suppress the powers that mediums have when it gets too overwhelming for them. I know, I couldn't believe it either, but when I met her mother, she told me the whole thing, and she cried while telling it. My girlfriend also showed me the scars on her ankles, knees, and wrists, tiny little slits that I never noticed before, where the witch doctor cut her to drain some blood for the ceremony. So how did this topic of her being a medium come up? We were staying at a friend's house for his annual party, where we played drinking games, hit up his pool, do a bonfire, and then go gambling on horses. Everyone stayed in the house, but my girlfriend and I brought my new tent and blow-up mattress to stay in his backyard. It was a pretty rural area, and his backyard adjoined to a big cornfield. In the morning, we were pillow talking, and I thought she was just trying to scare me when she said,
Did you hear the little girl outside the tent last night?
I played along and said, yeah, that was creepy, right? She said that she circled around the tent a few times and then ran into the cornfield. The whole day I didn't think anything of it because I thought we were just playfully trying to scare each other in the morning. But later that night, I told my friend Mark, who owns the house, that my girlfriend said she heard a little girl hanging around our tent. His face went white, and he said,
Wait a minute. How the fuck do you know about the little girl? Are you serious?
And I said, what are you talking about? And I guess there's some urban myth story on his street that a little girl who went missing decades ago in the cornfields sometimes comes out of them at night, and he always thought it was bullshit. This is when I asked my girlfriend if she was serious, and did she actually hear a little girl? And that's when she came clean with the whole medium backstory. She said after Zimbabwe, her powers weren't as strong, but she would still get periodic ghosts that would try and talk to her. After I corroborated her crazy childhood medium story with her mom, I brought her to my dad's house where I grew up, and she could only stay in the house for a few minutes before she had to leave. She said the dread she felt in there was the most overwhelming sense of dread she had ever had in her life, and she never wanted to return. Okay, so to the Ouija board night. My brother is now 20 years old and I'm 22. My mom lives in a house in our small city's downtown area, and my brother spends a lot of time there because she lets him drink and smoke weed. He had been there with his girlfriend playing the Ouija board all night, and I got there after a night drinking with friends. The door was locked and I knocked. He came flying down the stairs and swished open the curtain to see me standing there. It looked like he had literally just seen a ghost. I've never seen him this scared. He just tells me to come inside and I wouldn't believe what was going on. He says he and his girlfriend have been playing the Ouija board, and they have this very strong, evil spirit who calls himself AZ, and they have been talking all night. He's AZ because he encompasses everything and is omnipresent, apparently. My brother says AZ has been spelling out, "Kill Mom," and saying evil things about her all night. She was sleeping in the room next door through it all. AZ was very sexual and vulgar. My brother said that he had knocked down a crucifix off the wall and opened and closed the bathroom door just a few minutes before I got there. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up because I believed my brother and I felt dread, but I didn't have proof that I saw with my own eyes. I watched them playing, and the planchette was whipping around the board answering questions quickly. AZ fixated on me and started by spelling out, "brother." My brother asked if he wanted to talk to me, and AZ said no. He asked if he liked me, and AZ said no. I then asked my brother to tell him that I don't believe in him, and I need a sign. AZ spelled out die. He then asked if he was going to hurt me, and AZ said no, and then spelled out mom. At that point, I went into my mom's room to make sure she was okay, and she was. When I was in her room, I stubbed my toe and tripped a little bit. I came back out into the living room and told Dan that mom was okay. My brother commanded AZ to leave my mother alone. He said that I still wanted to see a sign, and the board then spelled out trip. My brother asked him what he means by trip, and I told him that I just stubbed my toe in mom's room. Then I started addressing AZ myself. I said if I write down a word on a piece of paper, would he be able to see it and spell it? He said maybe. I asked if he would do it. He said no, so I started to verbally abuse him a little bit, calling him a coward and a pussy, and that if he really wanted us to know he was real, he would do it. The planchette started to fly around the board without stopping anywhere, but eventually spelled out short. I asked it if it wanted me to write short words, and it replied yes. I went to the far other side of the apartment with a piece of paper and a pen, and I wrote down C. I came back, and my brother asked him if he saw what I wrote and to spell it. The planchette slowly circled around the board and landed on S. Then it slowly went to E, and my heart raced. I almost started crying from emotion, and then it landed on X. My brother asked me if I wrote down sex, and I said no, and I started to shake. My brother cursed at AZ, calling him a pervert and telling him to quit playing around. The planchette promptly went to C, and I was like, holy shit. And then the planchette slid off the board with a pretty strong force, and my mom's cat came running out of my mom's room to the living room, jumped on the couch and scrambled across it, then crawled under the table. It was terrified of something. I have goosebumps every time I recount this. When my brother got AZ back on the board, I proceeded to keep playing the spelling game. Next with ocean, and then cream, and then 3 or 4 more words. And each time I would go into a different room and make sure no one could see what I wrote except for me, and I'd fold it up and put it in my pocket. Each time I came back into the living room, AZ spelled out the words faster and faster. I left the house, told my brother to be safe, and went to my friend's house up the road, because there's no way in hell I'd be going back to my dad's that night. I can't really explain the feeling you get when you know without a doubt that something is real, other than you are just overwhelmed with every emotion at the same time. Make no mistake about it, folks. Supernatural things do, without a doubt, exist. My wife has been reading the posts I've made here, and has enjoyed reading the input this community has offered. She asked that I share this account on her behalf, since, in her words, she's not good at telling stories. Her stepmother was very unique. For this story, we'll call her Annie. Annie had a very strong, unconventional sense of spirituality, claiming to be able to feel the auras of strangers, and strongly believed in the supernatural power of crystals. She had started to study books about the good and evil of witchcraft, even going as far as obtaining a Wiccan book which taught the reader how to make certain potions, including those that would supposedly make their gardens grow quicker. Since my wife and I grew up just down the road from each other, I had met Annie on several occasions and can vouch for her odd behavior. While my wife was in college, she would return home on the weekends to stay with her father and Annie. While there, she began to feel a sort of uneasiness being around her. The best way she could describe the feeling was that of malevolence, manipulation, and a sense of doom. On one night, my wife had returned home with a friend from college for a small celebration of her birthday. They each drank a glass of sangria and spent the evening talking to each other before deciding it was time to go to bed. Annie had already gone to sleep. The friend bedded down on the couch. Since her sister was out of town, my wife went into her bedroom, turned off the lights, and went to bed. She described the room as having a queen-size bed, with white string lights strung around the footboard of the bed frame. The closet was directly in front of the bed, and the door was standing open. Once she had fallen asleep, my wife said she had the worst dream she could ever remember having, the worst of which was being molested by a close family member. She woke up in a cold sweat and her heart racing, all the while telling herself it was just a dream. It was then that she felt like she was being watched. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the closet. She sat upright and looked closer. To her horror, there was something looking back at her. A small silhouette of a hooded figure stood just in the doorway of the closet. The lights on the bed cast an eerie glow into the opening, but it seemed as if the figure absorbed all light that hit it, causing it to appear as a black void. She said she racked her brain trying to remember if there was a jacket hanging low in the closet, or if something had fallen while she was asleep that might explain what she was seeing. As she leaned forward, the area where the figure's mouth would be began to open in what she thought was a smile. As the thing's smile got wider, the soft glow of the string lights reflected off of what she described as gnarled stubs of disgusting teeth. She said she became perturbed at the being and felt that it was what had caused her to have the awful dreams. The thing remained smiling and motionless in the closet, with its gaze fixed on my wife. The realization of what she was seeing finally hit her, so she got up and quickly edged her way out of the room, keeping an eye on the being, as to make sure it didn't follow. She made her way into the living room to find her friend still awake. Breathless, she urged her friend to go back into the room with her. They returned, turned on the lights, and looked into the closet, but found nothing out of the ordinary. There was nothing there that could have explained what she saw. Talking with her friend about the incident the next morning, she told my wife that when she came into the living room to get her, her face had turned pale white and drained of all color. Soon after, my wife dropped out of school and moved out of state to live with her mother. It was during this time she found out Annie had been associated with several people who had moved into a rent house on the property and practiced satanic rituals. It was never proven, but a mutilated horse had been found in the field, and it was believed that it was their doing. It was never determined if Annie had taken part in any of these people's practices. Some months later, the house where the incident had occurred burned down and was a total loss. My wife felt these things were related to her experience. 2 years later, my wife and I had started dating, and she moved in with me 1 county over. One night, while I was at work, she called me crying. She said her father had just called her and told her Annie had been found dead from an apparent overdose. My wife and I have talked about this at length due to my recent investigation into a supposedly haunted house. She and I both agree that what she saw was a demonic presence. Whether or not it was an omen of death and destruction is debatable, because the events that occurred afterwards could be dismissed as being circumstantial. We ruled out sleep paralysis due to the fact that she was able to sit up, orient herself, then stand and exit the room, all the while being able to see the thing. She and I feel that it's important to share these experiences for several reasons. Anyone is subject to witnessing paranormal events, and in most cases, they can be somewhat, if not very, traumatizing. As with any traumatic experience, it is healthy to talk about it, and I can tell from my recent experiences here that this is a good place to do so. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Send your story or email. Send your story or creepypasta to the email in the description. And click the link in the description to check out some shirts. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Corey Rhino, blah blah blah. Also, if you have any suggestions on where I might go to find some stories besides Reddit, let me know. Because I pick a theme and then scour Reddit for stories that haven't been done a million times that are decent. And it's hard to find those. So if you have any suggestions, let me know. And be good to animals, even people. See ya.
Can I help you?
Hi, I'm Father Karras.
Oh, thank God you're here, Father. Please come in.
Who the hell is it?
Is that your son there?
It's actually my daughter.
That's your daughter? Holy shit. Wow, you weren't kidding. Most of the time when someone wants an exorcist, there isn't a real possession.
Can you help her, Father?
Don't worry, honey. I'm gonna exorcise the piss out of her. But no matter what happens or what you hear, leave us be.
Oh, thank you, Father.
Huh?
Hello, I'm Father Karras.
Hey, ball bag, how are you?
Well, I'm alright. I had a hell of a time trying to find the place.
I don't give a shit.
Okay. Well, are you ready to be exorcised?
You think you could defeat me with your book?
Who said anything about defeating you? Why don't you go ahead and stand up for me? We're gonna start with some jumping jacks.
I'm not doing anything.
Oh, really? Well, see this here? It's holy water. Splash!
Ow!
Are you ready now? We got a long night ahead of us. We're gonna pound that sass right out of you. You're gonna eat lightning. You're gonna crap thunder. We're gonna have to put you in a cage, kid. There you go. Work those scrawny arms. Come on now, pick up the pace.
I need a break.
You ain't done yet.
I can't run anymore.
Push yourself.
My arms are on fire.
Stop whining. Pick that speed up.
I'm going as fast as I can. Okay?
Splash.
Ow! Stop doing that to me.
Wax on, wax off. What the hell's so funny about that? Why do you keep laughing?
Wax on, wax off.
Higher. Higher. You're only levitating like a foot off the bed.
I'm trying.
Try not. Do or do not. There is no try. Alright, one more thing and we're done. And it's the most difficult technique a demon can ever pull off.
What do I have to do?
Spin your head around 360 degrees.
Does it work?
If do right, no can defense. You can do it, kid. You can do it. You did it, kid. You're the best. Around. Now let's go throw your mom down the stairs.
Já, snemma, bergsbis, hreish. What? What? Oh, you think you just order me to give you a treat? You think you keep looking at the bag that I'll give you one. Is that what you think? You think you tell me when treats are handed out?